The pickaxe struck hard-packed earth with a metallic ring that echoed across the barren homestead. Etta Rose Dunne paused to wipe sweat from her brow, her calloused hands trembling from exhaustion. 5 months pregnant and alone on 40 acres. Of unforgiving Dakota Territory, she had been digging for 3 days straight. The well had to reach water soon, or she and her unborn child would face a choice between abandoning the land her late husband died for or dying of thirst alongside. His memory. When the wealthy cattleman's horse appeared on the horizon, Etta didn't look up from her work. She had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, and pride was all she had left. But Wes Callahan wasn't just any passing stranger, and what he saw in that determined woman with dirt under her fingernails would change both their lives forever. Would love prove stronger than the unforgiving frontier that tested every dream?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The pickaxe had belonged to Thomas. Etta Rose Dunne could feel his presence in the worn wooden handle, smooth from years of honest labor, as she swung it against the unforgiving Dakota earth for what felt like the 1,000th time that morning. The tool was one of the few things that remained of their shared dreams, along with the 40 acres of stubborn prairie land that stretched endlessly beneath the merciless August sun. 2 years ago, Thomas had stood on this very spot with his arm around her waist, pointing toward the rolling hills that disappeared into the horizon. "We'll build something here, Etta Rose," he had promised, his voice filled with the kind of certainty that made her believe anything was possible. "Cattle will graze on those slopes, and we'll have the finest ranch in all of Dakota Territory." She had believed him then, trusted in his vision of prosperity carved from nothing but determination and hard work. They had arrived with little more than their savings from his factory job back in Ohio, a wagon loaded with basic supplies, and hearts full of hope that the frontier would offer them opportunities that civilization never could. Those first months had been magical, despite the hardships. Working side by side to build their small cabin before winter set in, learning to read the weather patterns that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, and planning the layout of their future ranch with the enthusiasm of young dreamers who had never encountered obstacles they couldn't overcome together. Thomas had taken the job at the copper mine reluctantly, understanding that they needed steady income while establishing their homestead. The work was dangerous, but it paid better than anything else available in their small community, and they had convinced themselves it was temporary. Just until they could afford their first cattle, just until the ranch could support them, just until their dreams became reality. 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, the mine had collapsed. 17 men died. In the cave-in, including Thomas, who had been working the deepest shaft because it paid the highest wages. The mining company had offered token compensation to the widows, barely enough to cover burial expenses before quickly resuming operations as if nothing had happened. Now, Etta found herself alone on 40 acres of land that seemed determined to defeat her. This summer had been brutally hot and dry, causing the small creek that ran along the eastern border of their property to dwindle to a trickle before disappearing entirely. The well they had dug near the cabin had never been reliable, producing only enough water for basic household needs, and even that source was beginning to fail. Without adequate water, their dreams of cattle ranching were impossible. Without cattle, the land was worthless. And without the land, everything she and Thomas had worked for would be lost forever. The vultures had begun circling within days of Thomas's funeral. Land speculators and neighboring ranchers who had initially dismissed the young couple from Ohio suddenly saw opportunity in Etta's desperate circumstances. Their offers were insulting fractions of what the land was worth, presented with thinly veiled impatience for her to accept reality and move on. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Dunne," banker Harrison Morrison had said during his most recent visit, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the foreclosure papers spread across her kitchen table. "A woman in your condition cannot possibly manage this. Property alone. Take Mr. Bradley's offer and move back east where you belong. Your child deserves to grow up in civilization, not in this godforsaken wilderness." Morrison was a thin, nervous man who had never worked a day of physical labor in his life. Yet he spoke with the authority of someone who believed he understood the frontier better than those who actually lived it. His visits had become increasingly frequent as the mortgage payments grew more difficult to meet, and his patience with what he called her feminine stubbornness was clearly wearing thin. Etta had listened to his advice with the polite attention that her mother had taught her, to show to authority figures, then firmly declined his suggestions. She would not abandon the land that Thomas had died to pay for. She would not raise their child among the factory smoke and crowded tenements they had worked so hard to escape. And she certainly would not accept charity disguised as reasonable business advice from a man who had never risked everything for a dream. The townspeople of Millbrook had initially offered sympathy and support following Thomas's death, but their patience had limits. As the weeks turned to months and Etta continued to refuse all suggestions that she sell the property and move somewhere more appropriate for a widow with child, their sympathy gradually transformed into something closer to irritation. That woman is too proud for her own good, she had overheard Mrs. Fletcher telling the postmaster during her last visit to town. Someone should talk sense into her before she kills herself, and that baby trying to prove some foolish point about female independence. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her current circumstances. During Thomas's lifetime, they had been welcomed into the community as hard-working young people who represented the frontier spirit that everyone claimed to admire. Now, as a pregnant widow who refused to conform to expectations of feminine helplessness, she found herself increasingly excluded from the social networks that had once provided support and companionship. The cabin felt enormous and empty without Thomas's presence to fill it. Every evening, she would prepare dinner for two before remembering that she would be eating alone. Every morning, she would wake expecting to hear his voice planning their day's work before the reality of his absence settled over her like a heavy blanket. The baby growing within her provided both comfort and additional pressure. She could feel the child's movements growing stronger each day, reminding her that she was responsible for more than just her own survival. In 4 months, she would need to manage not only the demands of the homestead, but also the care of an infant, all while maintaining the independence that had become essential to her sense of self. Thomas's tools remained exactly where he had left them, hanging on pegs in the small shed he had built adjacent to the cabin. She had found herself spending time there during the evenings, running her hands over the implements that still carried the scent of his work. The pickaxe, the shovel, the hand-forged nails he had made himself during the long winter evenings. Each item told the story of their shared efforts to build something permanent from the raw materials of hope and determination. It was while organizing these tools that she had decided to dig the new well. The location made sense from a practical standpoint, closer to the planned site of their cattle barn, positioned to take advantage of natural drainage patterns that might indicate underground water sources. But more importantly, the work gave her a way to feel connected to Thomas's vision, to continue the building process they had started together. For 3 days, she had been attacking the chosen spot with systematic determination. The work was backbreaking, especially in her condition, but she had developed a rhythm that allowed her to make steady progress. Dig for 30 minutes, rest for 10, drink water sparingly from her dwindling supply, then return to the hole that grew deeper with each session. The soil was harder than she had anticipated, packed solid by years of drought, and filled with rocks that had to be painstakingly removed by hand. Her palms had developed thick calluses, and her back ached constantly, but she could see progress in the deepening depression that marked her labor. The countryside around their homestead stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the locations of seasonal water sources. It was beautiful in its own stark way, but it was also unforgiving to those who underestimated its challenges. The nearest neighbors were the Andersons, 5 miles to the north, and they had made it clear that they considered Etta's situation hopeless and her continued efforts foolishly optimistic. Despite the isolation and the physical demands of her daily survival, Etta had discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. Each morning brought new challenges, from maintaining the vegetable garden that provided most of her food to repairing the small damages that accumulated constantly in their rough cabin. She had learned to do things that Thomas had always handled: shopping, firewood, maintaining their few pieces of equipment, and managing the complex calculations required to stretch their limited resources through each week. The work was honest and satisfying in ways that her previous life had never been. Back in Ohio, she had been dependent on Thomas's factory wages and her own occasional seamstress work, always subject to the whims of employers and economic conditions beyond their control. Here on the frontier, success or failure depended entirely on her own efforts and decisions. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. As the sun reached its zenith and the heat became almost unbearable, Etta paused in her digging to survey the progress she had made. The hole was now chest deep and wide enough for her to work comfortably. Though still showing no signs of the water table, she desperately needed to reach. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the wide-brimmed hat that provided some protection from the brutal sun, and her dress was soaked through with perspiration and dust. It was then that she noticed the dust cloud on the western horizon, moving steadily in her direction. A rider was approaching, which was unusual enough to warrant attention. Few people traveled this particular route unless they had specific business, with the homesteaders scattered across this section of the territory, and Etta couldn't think of anyone who might be coming to visit her. She continued working as the rider drew closer, refusing to show curiosity about his identity or purpose. Experience had taught her that unexpected visitors often brought unwelcome news, or pressure to make decisions she wasn't prepared to consider. Better to focus on the work at hand and deal with whatever business the stranger might bring when he actually arrived. The rhythmic impact of pickaxe against earth provided a meditative quality to her labor, allowing her mind to drift between memories of happier times and plans for the uncertain future. Each swing represented progress toward the goal that might determine whether she could maintain her independence or would be forced to accept defeat and abandon everything she and Thomas had built together. When the horse's hoofbeats finally became audible over the sound of her work, Etta didn't look up from the hole that represented her last best hope for survival on the unforgiving frontier that had already taken so much from her, but might yet provide the foundation for the future she was determined to build for herself and her unborn child. Wes Callahan had seen many things during his 32 years that challenged his understanding of human nature, but the sight before him defied every assumption he had ever made about the limitations of determination. A woman, visibly pregnant and covered in dust from head to toe, was wielding a pickaxe with the methodical precision of a seasoned miner, attacking the Dakota earth as if her life depended on it, which, he realized as he drew his horse to a stop. At a respectful distance, it probably did. The woman didn't acknowledge his presence, continuing her work with a focus that spoke of desperation, masked as routine. Each swing of the heavy tool sent reverberations through her small frame, yet she maintained a steady rhythm that suggested she had been at this particular task for some time. The hole she was excavating was already impressive in its depth and scope, clearly representing days of backbreaking labor. Wes dismounted slowly, not wanting to startle her, and secured his horse to a sturdy fence post that marked the boundary of what was obviously a working homestead. The property showed signs of careful planning and honest labor: a neat cabin with a well-maintained vegetable garden, outbuildings positioned for efficiency rather than appearance, and the unmistakable evidence of people who understood how to coax productivity from unforgiving land. "Ma'am," he called out, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that had been ingrained in him since childhood. "I don't mean to interrupt your work, but I wonder if you might be in need of assistance." The woman paused in her digging, straightening slowly and fixing him with a gaze that was equal parts wariness and irritation. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably no more than 25, with auburn hair that had escaped from its practical bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. Despite the obvious physical demands of her current situation, there was a grace about her that spoke of refinement and education. "I appreciate your concern, sir," she replied, her voice carrying the cultured accent of someone from back east, "but I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." Wes noted the careful politeness of her response, the kind of courtesy that maintained social boundaries while making her position absolutely clear. This was not a woman who welcomed interference, regardless of how well-intentioned it might be. Yet something about her situation, the advanced stage of her pregnancy, the obvious difficulty of the work she was attempting, the isolation of her circumstances, made it impossible for him to simply ride away. "I'm Wes Callahan," he offered, hoping that a proper introduction might ease her suspicions. "I'm passing through on business, checking on a cattle herd I'm considering purchasing from the Anderson spread. I couldn't help but notice your excavation project." The woman studied him for a long moment, taking in his quality clothing, expensive saddle, and well-bred horse with the shrewd assessment of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "Mrs. Etta Dunne," she replied finally. "And yes, I'm digging a well. The previous water source has failed, and this location offers the best prospects for reaching the water table." Wes felt a stab of admiration mixed with concern. She spoke of her undertaking with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine maintenance rather than a project that would challenge experienced men with proper equipment. "Mrs. Dunne, forgive me for being direct, but well digging is dangerous work under the best of circumstances. In your condition, attempting such a project alone seems—" "Seems what, Mr. Callahan?" The edge that entered her voice suggested he was approaching the limits of her patience. Foolish? Inappropriate? Impossible? The challenge in her tone told him everything he needed to know about the kind of advice she had been receiving from other well-meaning individuals. Clearly, Mrs. Etta Dunne had heard every variation of why she should abandon her efforts and accept more conventional solutions to her circumstances. "I was going to say dangerous," he finished quietly. "The walls of a deep excavation can collapse without warning, especially in this type of soil. And if you were to strike water suddenly, the inflow could trap you before you could escape." Something in his tone, perhaps, the absence of condescension that had probably characterized other people's advice, seemed to penetrate her defensive stance. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though she maintained her grip on the pickaxe as if it were a talisman of independence. "Mr. Callahan, I understand the risks involved in this undertaking," she said with weary dignity. "I also understand that without a reliable water source, this land is worthless, and without this land, I have nothing left of the life my husband and I built together. Sometimes the dangerous choice is the only choice that offers any hope at all." The mention of her husband clarified several aspects of her situation. The past tense suggested widowhood, which explained both her current circumstances and her fierce determination to maintain independence. Wes found himself studying her face more carefully, noting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of recent grief, and the set of her jaw that indicated a will strengthened by adversity. "How long have you been working on this well?" he asked, approaching the edge of the excavation to examine her progress. "3 days," she admitted, a note of defensive pride creeping into her voice. "I'm making good progress, considering the conditions." Wes looked down into the hole, which was indeed impressive for one person working alone. But his experience with well digging told him that she was still far from reaching the depth necessary to tap into reliable groundwater, and the walls of her excavation showed the kind of instability that made collapse a genuine threat. "Mrs. Dunne," he said carefully, "I have some experience with this type of work. If you would permit me to assist, we could probably reach water in half the time, and with considerably greater safety." Asterisk. The look she gave him could have frozen water in July. "I'm sure you mean well, Mr. Callahan, but I am not a charity case. I neither need nor want assistance from passing strangers who feel sorry for the poor pregnant widow." The bitterness in her voice told him that his offer had been interpreted exactly as he had feared it would be, as pity disguised as helpfulness. He had encountered this type of pride before, particularly among people who had been forced by circumstances to depend too heavily on the kindness of others. It was a kind of protective armor that prevented further humiliation, even at the cost of accepting help that might be genuinely beneficial. "I wasn't offering charity," he said quietly. "I was offering partnership." She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of the distinction. "Partnership in what, exactly?" "Well digging is skilled work," he explained, settling into a more comfortable position for what he sensed would be a lengthy negotiation. "I've dug dozens of wells over the years, and I know techniques that could save you weeks of labor. In return, You could teach me something about this country that I'm considering investing in. Fair exchange of expertise, nothing more. It was partially true. Wes had indeed supervised the digging of numerous wells on his family's properties, though he had rarely participated in the actual physical labor. But something about Etta Dunne's situation had awakened a protective instinct that he hadn't experienced since his sister's death, and he found himself genuinely wanting to help regardless of what he might gain from the arrangement. The internal struggle was visible on her face as she weighed her desperate need for assistance against her equally desperate need to maintain independence. Pride warred with practicality, while the August sun beat down mercilessly on both of them. "What kind of expertise exactly?" she asked finally, her tone suggesting that she was at least willing to consider his proposal. "Reading soil conditions, understanding water table behavior, construction techniques for preventing wall collapse," he replied, encouraged by her apparent willingness to listen. "And I have access to better tools than what you're currently using." Etta looked down at Thomas's worn pickaxe, then back at the well-dressed stranger who claimed he wanted to help her for purely professional reasons. The rational part of her mind recognized that she needed assistance. If she was going to complete the well before winter made the work impossible. The emotional part of her mind rebelled against accepting help from anyone, especially a man whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone who had never known real hardship. "Mr. Callahan," she said slowly, "I appreciate your offer, but I need to understand your motivations. Men of your obvious means don't typically stop to help struggling homesteaders unless they expect something substantial in return." The directness of her question forced Wes to examine his own motives more honestly than he had been willing to do since first seeing her attacking the stubborn earth with such determination. What was it about this particular woman in this particular situation that had compelled him to stop? Why did her struggle matter to him when he had ridden past countless other examples of frontier hardship without a second thought? "My sister died in childbirth 2 years ago," he heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. "I was away on business when it happened. Told myself that my responsibilities to the family holdings were more important than being present for her confinement. She died alone because I chose commerce over family, and I've been trying to find ways to balance that ledger ever since." The honesty of his response seemed to surprise them both. Etta studied his face with the kind of intense scrutiny that suggested she was reevaluating her initial assessment of his character and motivations. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, her tone softening for the first time since his arrival. "But I'm not your sister, Mr. Callahan, and my situation is not an opportunity for you to assuage your guilt about past failures." The woman's directness was both refreshing and challenging. Most people of his acquaintance would never have been so blunt about psychological motivations, preferring the comfortable fiction of purely practical concerns. Yet her willingness to confront the difficult truths head-on suggested a strength of character that demanded equal honesty in return. "You're right," he admitted, "but that doesn't change the fact that you need help, and I have the skills and resources to provide it. Whether my motivations are entirely pure is less important than whether working together can solve your immediate problem." Etta considered his words while absently placing a protective hand over her swollen belly, a gesture that reminded them both of the additional life that would be affected by her decisions. The baby seemed to respond to her touch with a series of small movements that were visible even through her dress. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked finally. "Partnership," he repeated. "I provide equipment, expertise, and labor. You provide local knowledge, food, and a place to stay while we complete the work. When we strike water, I continue on my way, and you have what you need to make this homestead successful." The arrangement he described sounded reasonable, even generous. Yet Etta found herself searching for the hidden costs that experience had taught her to expect from seemingly benevolent offers. Men like Wes Callahan didn't typically invest time and effort without expecting returns that weren't immediately apparent. "And you want nothing else in return?" she pressed. "No claim on the land, no percentage of future profits, no other considerations?" The implication behind her final phrase hung in the air between them like a challenge. Wes realized that she was testing not just his business intentions, but his personal ones as well, making sure he understood that their potential partnership would be strictly professional. Nothing else, he confirmed, meeting her gaze steadily. My word as a gentleman. The formal phrase seemed to amuse her slightly, perhaps because it belonged to a world of social conventions that had little relevance to frontier reality. Yet, something in his manner convinced her that his promise, however quaintly expressed, was genuine. Very well, Mr. Callahan, she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was both businesslike and surprisingly graceful. We have a partnership, but I want it understood that this is my land, my well, and my decision-making authority. You're a consultant, not a manager. Wes shook her hand, noting the calluses that marked her as someone who understood physical work, and the strength of her grip that suggested she was far from the helpless female that others apparently assumed her to be. Understood completely, Mrs. Dunne, he replied. When do we start? The transformation of Ada's well-digging project began at dawn the following morning, when Wes arrived with a wagon loaded with equipment that represented more value than she had seen in months. Professional-grade shovels, pickaxes designed for different soil conditions, rope and pulley systems for removing excavated material, and wooden supports for preventing wall collapse, tools that marked the difference between amateur hope and professional competence. Where did you acquire all this? Etta asked, running her hands over a shovel that was obviously crafted for serious excavation work. The Anderson spread had extra equipment, Wes replied, beginning to unload the wagon with efficient movements. They were happy to loan it in exchange for my evaluation of their cattle operation. The explanation was plausible, though Etta suspected it involved financial arrangements that Wes was diplomatically omitting from his account. She had learned to recognize the careful way that wealthy people managed to provide assistance without acknowledging the economic advantages that made such generosity possible. Working together, they established a rhythm that maximized both efficiency and safety. Wes demonstrated techniques for reading soil composition and adjusting digging strategies accordingly, while Etta's intimate knowledge of the property's drainage patterns helped identify the most promising locations for reaching groundwater. Land slopes slightly toward the east, she explained, pointing toward a barely perceptible grade that was invisible to casual observation. During the spring floods 2 years ago, water collected in a depression about 50 yards in that direction, which suggests the water table might be higher than average in this general area. Her analysis proved accurate. As they deepened the excavation, the soil began showing signs of moisture content that indicated proximity to groundwater. What had seemed like an impossible task when undertaken alone began to feel achievable when, approached with proper tools and shared expertise, the physical demands of the work created an unusual intimacy between them. Necessity required close cooperation, one person digging while the other managed the rope system for removing debris, frequent consultation about structural decisions, and the kind of wordless communication that develops between people engaged. In dangerous work together, Etta found herself studying Wes with growing curiosity as they worked. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who had done physical labor despite his obvious wealth. Intriguingly, he possessed technical knowledge that suggested genuine experience rather than theoretical understanding of construction work. You've done this before, she observed during their midday break, noting how effortlessly he had rigged the pulley system that was doubling their excavation speed. My father believes that men should understand the work they supervise, Wes replied, accepting the simple meal of bread and cheese that Etta had prepared. I've spent time learning every aspect of ranch operation, from digging wells to building fences to managing livestock. The comment revealed an upbringing that valued practical skills alongside wealth, which partially explained his competence with manual labor. But it also suggested family expectations and responsibilities that might conflict with his current decision to help a struggling homesteader. Won't your family be concerned about your extended absence? Etta asked, realizing that she knew virtually nothing about his personal circumstances beyond his willingness to assist her. A shadow crossed Wes's face, suggesting that family relationships were a complicated subject. They're accustomed to my business travels taking longer than originally planned, he said carefully. Besides, investing time in understanding local conditions is essential for making sound decisions about cattle purchases. The deflection was smooth but incomplete, leaving Etta with the impression that there were aspects of his situation that he preferred not to discuss. She understood the desire for privacy about personal matters, having grown tired of explaining her own circumstances to curious neighbors. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elaine Martinez, the nearest neighbor woman, who had ridden over to investigate the presence of a strange wagon on Etta's property. Elena was a practical woman whose own husband had died in a farming accident the previous year, leaving her to manage their small spread with the help of her teenage sons. "Etta, dear," Elena called out, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had spent her life around horses. "I saw the activity here and wanted to make sure everything was all right." The concern in Elena's voice carried undertones of protective suspicion as she studied Wes with the careful attention of someone evaluating potential threats to a vulnerable friend. Elena had appointed herself as Etta's unofficial guardian since Thomas's death, providing both practical assistance and social support when other members of the community had begun to distance themselves from the stubborn widow. "Elena, I'd like you to meet Wes Callahan," Etta said, noting how Wes immediately removed his hat and offered a respectful greeting. "He's helping me complete the well in exchange for information about local ranching conditions." Elena's evaluation of Wes was thorough and only partially concealed. She studied his clothes, his equipment, his manner of speaking, and most importantly, his interaction with Etta. After several minutes of casual conversation, her posture relaxed slightly, suggesting that she had reached preliminary approval of the arrangement. "It's good to see Etta getting proper help with this project," Elena said diplomatically. "Well digging is dangerous work, especially for someone in her condition." The phrase "in her condition" reminded everyone present of the additional life that would be affected by the success or failure of their current undertaking. Etta's pregnancy was becoming more apparent each day, adding urgency to their need to reach water before winter made continued excavation impossible. After Elena's departure, work resumed with renewed focus. The afternoon brought them to a depth where structural supports became essential for preventing collapse, and Wes demonstrated techniques for installing wooden bracing that would maintain wall integrity as they continued downward. "The key is distributing the load evenly," he explained, positioning timber supports with mathematical precision. "Soil pressure increases exponentially with depth, so each support beam must be positioned to transfer weight to the most stable points." His technical knowledge was impressive, suggesting education that went beyond practical experience. Etta found herself wondering about his background and the circumstances that had led to his presence on her isolated homestead at precisely the moment when she most needed assistance. As evening approached, the question of sleeping arrangements became unavoidable. Wes had obviously planned to camp somewhere on the property, as evidenced by the bedroll and supplies loaded in his wagon. But the approaching weather suggested that outdoor sleeping might be uncomfortable. "There's a small room attached to the barn," Etta offered, struggling with the social complexities of housing an unmarried man on her property. "It's not luxurious, but it's dry and secure." "That's very kind," Wes replied, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. "I want to assure you that my presence here is purely professional. I have no intentions beyond completing our agreed-upon work." The formal reassurance was probably necessary, given the gossip that would inevitably result from his extended stay on her property. Frontier communities were notorious for their interest in the personal lives of their members, and a wealthy stranger assisting a pregnant widow would certainly provide abundant material for speculation. That evening, Etta prepared dinner for two people for the first time since Thomas's death. The simple act of cooking for company felt both foreign and comforting, reminding her of domestic routines that had once provided structure and meaning to her daily life. "This is excellent," Wes said, accepting a second helping of the stew that Etta had prepared from vegetables grown in her own garden. "You're clearly skilled at making the most of available resources." The compliment was genuine, though it also highlighted the economic disparities between them. What represented creativity born of necessity to Etta was probably viewed as charming frontier authenticity by someone accustomed to professional cooks and elaborate meals. Thomas always said that good food could be made from simple ingredients. "If you understood the principles involved," Etta replied, feeling the familiar pang that accompanied any mention of her late husband. He was an excellent cook himself, which was fortunate since my domestic skills were somewhat theoretical when we first married. The admission revealed something about her background that piqued Wes's curiosity. Most frontier women possessed practical skills from childhood, yet Etta spoke as if domestic competence had been acquired rather than inherited. "What brought you and your husband to Dakota Territory?" he asked, hoping the question wasn't too personal for their current level of acquaintance. "Dreams of independence," Etta replied simply. "Thomas worked in a factory back in Ohio, and we both felt trapped by the limitations of industrial employment. The frontier offered opportunities to build something that belonged entirely to us, without supervisors or shareholders determining our fate." Her explanation resonated with Wes more than he had expected. Despite his family's wealth, he had often felt constrained by expectations and responsibilities that left little room for personal choice or individual achievement. The idea of starting fresh in a place where success depended entirely on personal effort held obvious appeal to Todd as they finished their meal and prepared for sleep. Both were acutely aware that their partnership had evolved beyond simple business cooperation. Working closely together had created a sense of shared purpose that was both professionally satisfying and personally complicated. "Mr. Callahan," Etta said as he prepared to retire to the barn, "I want you to know that I appreciate your assistance more than I can adequately express. This well represents my only chance to maintain independence and provide for my child. Your willingness to help means everything to me." The sincerity of her gratitude touched him more deeply than he had anticipated. "Mrs. Dunne, I want you to know that this partnership has been more rewarding than any business transaction I've been involved with in years. Your determination and skill have impressed me tremendously." They stood for a moment in the doorway of her cabin, both recognizing that something significant had shifted in their relationship during their first day of working together. What had begun as practical cooperation was developing into something more complex and potentially more meaningful. The night air carried the scent of approaching rain, which would complicate their excavation work, but also indicated that the seasonal patterns were beginning to change. Time was becoming increasingly precious, and their window for completing the well before winter arrived was narrowing with each passing day. As Wes settled into his makeshift quarters in the barn, he found himself thinking about Etta's combination of vulnerability and strength, her gracious acceptance of help despite obvious pride, and the way she had spoken about Thomas with love that remained undiminished by grief. He had not expected to find such complexity in a chance encounter on a remote homestead. Meanwhile, Etta lay in her bed, listening to the distant sounds of Wes settling in for the night, wondering about the man who had appeared at precisely the moment when she most needed assistance. His presence had transformed an impossible task into an achievable goal, but it had also introduced complications that she was not entirely prepared to navigate. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if responding to her unsettled thoughts about the changes that a single day had brought to her carefully maintained solitude. The rain that had threatened the previous evening arrived with dawn, transforming their excavation site into a muddy challenge that tested both their engineering skills and their growing partnership. What should have been a setback became an opportunity for Wes to demonstrate water management techniques that would serve Etta well throughout future seasons. "The key is controlling the flow rather than fighting it," he explained, positioning wooden channels to direct rainwater away from their work area. "This same principle will help you manage spring runoff and prevent erosion around your future cattle operations." Etta watched him work with growing admiration for his practical knowledge. The man possessed an engineer's understanding of water behavior combined with a craftsman's skill in implementing solutions quickly and efficiently. More importantly, he shared his expertise freely, treating her as a student rather than a spectator. "Where did you learn these techniques?" she asked, helping him secure a particularly crucial drainage channel. "Necessity," Wes replied, his hands steady despite the difficult working conditions. "Our family ranch spans several drainage basins, and managing water flow during storm seasons can mean the difference between profit and disaster. My father insisted that I understand every aspect of land management, including the less glamorous technical details." The mention of his family's ranch prompted questions that Etta had been reluctant to ask directly. If Wes came from a successful ranching family, what was he doing traveling alone through Dakota Territory instead of managing established operations? And why did he seem so comfortable with physical labor that most wealthy men would delegate to hired hands? Their work was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patterson, the traveling physician who made monthly rounds through the scattered homesteads in their region. He had come to check on Etta's pregnancy and was visibly surprised to find her engaged in heavy construction work alongside a well-dressed stranger. "Mrs. Dunne," Dr. Patterson said, his tone carrying the professional authority that medical men used when dispensing advice they expected to be followed without question. "I hardly think that excavation work is appropriate for a woman in your advanced condition." Etta felt her jaw tighten at the familiar refrain of medical paternalism that had become increasingly frequent as her pregnancy progressed. "Dr. Patterson, I'm perfectly capable of determining what activities are appropriate for my condition, and Mr. Callahan has been very careful to ensure that I'm not exposed to unnecessary risks." Wes stepped forward, recognizing the delicate social dynamics at play. "Doctor, I have extensive experience with construction safety, and I can assure you that Mrs. Dunne's participation has been limited to tasks that pose no threat to her or her child's well-being." Dr. Patterson studied Wes with the careful attention of someone trying to place him within the limited social categories that frontier life provided. Quality clothing suggested wealth, technical competence suggested education, and his protective stance toward Etta suggested personal interest that might extend beyond simple business cooperation. "And you are?" Dr. Patterson inquired, his tone suggesting that he expected an explanation for Wes's presence that would clarify the propriety of the current arrangement. "Wes Callahan," came the reply, accompanied by a handshake that conveyed both confidence and respect. "I'm assisting Mrs. Dunne with well construction in exchange for information about local ranching conditions. The arrangement is mutually beneficial and entirely professional." The explanation satisfied Dr. Patterson's immediate concerns about social propriety, though Etta could see that he remained skeptical about the wisdom of her continued involvement in physical labor. Medical opinion of the era strongly favored complete rest during the final months of pregnancy, advice that was practical for women with household staffs but impossible for those managing frontier homesteads alone. After examining Etta and pronouncing both mother and child to be in excellent health, Dr. Patterson departed with renewed warnings about the importance of avoiding strenuous activity. His visit had been brief, but had reinforced Etta's awareness of how unusual her current situation appeared to outside observers. "Does his disapproval concern you?" Wes asked as they resumed work after the doctor's departure. "Dr. Patterson means well," Etta replied diplomatically, "but his advice is designed for women whose circumstances allow them the luxury of complete rest. I can't afford to stop working simply because it would be more conventional to do so." Her response revealed the pragmatic approach to social expectations that frontier life had forced her to develop. Conventional wisdom about appropriate female behavior often conflicted with the realities of survival in situations where conformity could mean the difference between success and failure. As the day progressed, their excavation reached a depth where the soil composition began to change dramatically. The hard-packed clay that had dominated the upper layers gave way to sandy loam that was easier to dig but more prone to collapse. Wes's structural reinforcements proved their worth as the walls remained stable despite the less reliable soil conditions. "We're getting close," Etta observed, noting the increased moisture content in the excavated material. "The soil is definitely holding more water at this depth." "Another few feet should do it," Wes agreed, studying the geological indicators with practiced expertise. "The water table in this region typically lies between 15 and 20 feet below surface level, and we're approaching 18 feet. Now, their conversation was interrupted by the discovery of something unexpected in the bottom of their excavation. Etta's shovel struck an object that was clearly not natural stone or root material, and careful excavation revealed the corner of what appeared to be a wooden box wrapped in oiled canvas. "What do you suppose it is?" Wes asked, helping her lift the mysterious object from its resting place in the earth. The box was roughly the size that might hold important documents or valuable items, and its careful wrapping suggested that someone had buried it intentionally rather than simply discarding unwanted materials. Most intriguingly, it showed no signs of significant age or deterioration, indicating that it had been placed in its current location relatively recently. "Thomas," Etta whispered, recognizing her late husband's careful handiwork in the construction of the wooden container. "This is something Thomas buried. But why would he hide something in a location where we planned to dig a well?" Unwrapping the oiled canvas revealed a collection of items that told a story Etta had never suspected. Documents bearing Thomas's handwriting, sketches of furniture designs, and most poignantly, a half-carved rocking chair that represented dreams they had shared but never had the opportunity to fulfill. He was planning for the baby, Etta realized, her voice thick with emotion as she examined the evidence of Thomas's secret preparations. All these furniture designs, these sketches of nursery arrangements, he was preparing surprises for after the birth. Among the documents were detailed plans for expanding their homestead operations, including calculations for optimal herd sizes, seasonal grazing rotations, and water management systems that would support significant cattle operations. Thomas had clearly been thinking far beyond their immediate survival needs, planning for the prosperous future they had dreamed of building together. "He chose this location for the well deliberately," Wes observed, studying Thomas's notes about water table depths and soil composition. "These calculations show that he understood exactly where to dig for optimal results. He buried this box here because he knew you would eventually excavate this precise spot." The realization that Thomas had somehow anticipated her current circumstances added layers of poignancy to an already emotional discovery. He had prepared for possibilities that neither of them had wanted to contemplate, leaving behind guidance and encouragement for a future he would not share. Most touching of all was a letter addressed to Etta in Thomas's careful handwriting, sealed with wax and marked, "To be opened when the well reaches water." He had somehow known that this moment would arrive, and he had prepared a final message for the wife who would need to carry on their shared dreams alone. "Should I read it now?" Etta asked, her hands trembling as she held the letter that represented Thomas's final communication with her. "That's entirely your decision," Wes replied gently, understanding that he was witnessing something intensely private despite his inadvertent involvement in its discovery. Etta broke the wax seal with careful reverence, unfolding the paper that contained words Thomas had written during the final weeks of his life. His message was brief but profound, expressing his confidence in her strength, his love for their unborn child, and his certainty that she would find ways to succeed despite whatever challenges the future might bring. "He says that if I'm reading this letter, it means the well has reached water and our dreams are still alive," Etta said, tears streaming down her face as she shared Thomas's final words. "He says that love doesn't end with death, and that every success I achieve will be something we accomplish together." The emotional weight of the discovery temporarily overwhelmed both of them. Wes found himself deeply moved by the evidence of love that had transcended death, while Etta struggled to process the realization that Thomas had somehow prepared for her current circumstances with characteristic thoughtfulness and care. "We should finish the well," Etta said finally, carefully returning Thomas's treasures to their protective wrapping. "He would want us to complete what we started." Their renewed excavation took on additional significance as they worked to fulfill not only Etta's practical needs, but also Thomas's vision for their shared future. Each shovelful of earth brought them closer to the water that would make their homestead viable and honor the memory of the man who had planned so carefully for contingencies he hoped would never arise. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, their persistence was finally rewarded. Wes's shovel struck saturated soil, and within minutes, clear water began seeping into the bottom of their excavation. They had reached the water table, exactly where Thomas's calculations had predicted they would find it. "We did it," Etta breathed, watching as the bottom of their well slowly filled with the life-giving water that represented security, independence, and a foundation for all their future plans. Standing together at the edge of their successful excavation, both were acutely aware that their partnership had achieved something that neither could have accomplished alone. More than that, they had honored the memory of a good man while laying the groundwork for a future that remained full of possibility despite the sorrows that had preceded it. The baby stirred within Etta as if celebrating their achievement, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt genuine optimism about her ability to provide for her child and maintain the independence that had become so precious to her God as they began the process of installing the wooden framework that would prevent the well walls from collapsing and keep the water source clean and accessible. Both were surprised by how naturally they worked together and how much their professional partnership had come to mean to them personally. The evening ahead would bring new conversations and deeper understanding of each other's circumstances. But for now, they were content to focus on the practical satisfaction of having achieved something significant through shared effort and mutual respect. Thomas's unfinished rocking chair sat nearby, a tangible reminder that love could survive death and that dreams could endure even when the dreamers themselves could not. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they could celebrate a victory that honored the past while securing the future. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Billy Henderson, who rode the mail route between Millbrook and the scattered homesteads that dotted the surrounding prairie. The yellow envelope bore the distinctive markings of urgent correspondence, and the return address indicated it had originated from the Callahan Ranch headquarters in Colorado. Wes accepted the telegram with a sense of foreboding that proved entirely justified when he read its contents. The message was brief and unambiguous. Return immediately. Father's condition deteriorating. Business decisions require your presence. Eleanor arriving Thursday to escort you home. Mother. Etta noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. The easy confidence that had characterized his manner throughout their work together was replaced by tension that seemed to emanate from every line of his body as he read and reread the telegram. Bad news? She asked, though his expression had already provided the answer. Family business, Wes replied carefully, folding the telegram and placing it in his vest pocket. It appears my presence is required at home more urgently than I had anticipated. The careful neutrality of his response suggested layers of complication that he was reluctant to discuss. Etta had learned to recognize the particular strain that came from family obligations that conflicted with personal desires, having experienced similar pressures during her own decision to leave Ohio for the uncertainties of frontier life. Will you need to leave immediately? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the sudden realization of how much she had come to depend on his presence. The telegram mentioned someone arriving Thursday to escort me back, Wes said, his tone suggesting that this arrangement was not entirely welcome. I have until then to complete our work here. 3 days. The timeline seemed simultaneously too short and dangerously long. Too short to finish all the projects they had planned for, improving the homestead's water systems, yet long enough for whatever family crisis awaited his return to potentially worsen in his absence. They worked with renewed intensity over the following days, racing to complete not only the well infrastructure, but also several additional improvements that would help Etta manage the property independently. Wes demonstrated techniques for maintaining the well's wooden framework, showed her how to construct simple irrigation channels for her vegetable garden, and helped her complete several of Thomas's unfinished projects that would improve the cabin's comfort and functionality. The rocking chair should be completed like this, he explained, showing her how Thomas had intended to join the curved runners to the seat assembly. The design is actually quite sophisticated. He was a skilled craftsman. Working together on Thomas's final project created an unexpected intimacy between them. Etta found herself sharing memories of her late husband that she had never discussed with anyone, while Wes revealed details about his own family situation that helped explain both his technical competence and his apparent reluctance to return home. My father built our ranch from nothing, Wes said, as they carefully sanded the wooden pieces that would complete the rocking chair. He's a remarkable man in many ways, but he has very specific ideas about how his sons should conduct their lives and what constitutes appropriate business decisions. The implication that Wes's current activities might not meet with paternal approval added context to his obvious tension about the approaching departure. Etta began to understand that his willingness to help her might represent a form of rebellion against family expectations that valued financial gain over humanitarian concerns. And Eleanor? Etta asked, having caught the name mentioned in the ad. "Telegram. Eleanor Whitmore," Wes replied after a moment's hesitation. "She's someone my family considers an appropriate choice for my future." The careful phrasing told Etta everything she needed to know about the nature of Eleanor's relationship with Wes. An arranged engagement, probably based on financial and social considerations rather than personal affection. Such arrangements were common among wealthy families, though they often created personal complications that became more apparent as the individuals involved matured and developed independent preferences. Wednesday evening brought them to the completion of their major projects. The well was functioning perfectly, providing clear, cold water in quantities that would support both household needs and modest livestock operations. The irrigation channels were directing water efficiently to Etta's expanded vegetable garden. Thomas's rocking chair was assembled and ready for the baby who would arrive in just a few months. As they surveyed their accomplishments, both were acutely aware that their partnership was approaching its conclusion. What had begun as a practical business arrangement had evolved into something much more significant, though neither had directly acknowledged the personal feelings that had developed alongside their professional cooperation. "Mrs. Dunne," Wes said formally as they stood beside the completed well, "I want you to know that this week has been among the most satisfying experiences of my adult life. Your strength and determination have impressed me more than I can adequately express." "Mr. Callahan," Etta replied with equal formality, "your assistance has made the difference between success and failure for me and my child. I will never forget your kindness and expertise." The careful politeness of their exchange masked deeper emotions that both recognized but felt unable to express directly. Social conventions and practical circumstances created barriers that seemed insurmountable. Despite the obvious affection that had grown between them, Thursday morning arrived with Eleanor Whitmore. She descended from an elegant carriage with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making impressive entrances. Her fashionable traveling costume and perfectly arranged hair creating a stark contrast to the rough frontier environment. Eleanor was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of refined features and sophisticated bearing that marked her as someone from the highest levels of society. "Wesley," she called out, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone trained in proper elocution. "What a perfectly dreadful place you've chosen to disappear to. Mother has been beside herself with worry about your extended absence." Wes emerged from the barn, where he had been packing his equipment, his expression carefully controlled as he greeted the woman who represented his family's expectations for his future. "Eleanor, I wasn't expecting you to make the journey personally. The telegram suggested that travel arrangements had been made, not that you would be serving as escort." "Asterisk, don't be silly," Eleanor replied, brushing imaginary dust from her immaculate gloves. "I couldn't possibly allow you to travel alone in your current state of mind. Besides, I was curious to see what sort of frontier adventure could possibly justify such an extended delay in your return." Her tone suggested amusement rather than genuine concern, and her casual dismissal of his activities as mere adventure revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both his motivations and the significance of what he had been accomplishing. Etta emerged from the cabin at that moment, her practical work dress and obvious pregnancy creating an immediate contrast with Eleanor's refined appearance. The two women studied each other with the careful assessment that often characterizes first meetings between individuals who instinctively recognize potential conflict. "Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Etta Dunne," Wes said, his voice carrying subtle tension as he attempted to navigate the social complexities of the situation. "Mrs. Dunne, this is Miss Eleanor Whitmore." "How ... Interesting," Eleanor said, her tone conveying polite interest that barely concealed her shock at finding Wes in such circumstances. "I had no idea that Wesley's business consultations involved such personal assistance." The slight emphasis on personal carried implications that made Etta's cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. Eleanor's meaning was clear. She viewed Etta's situation as inappropriate and Wes's involvement as potentially scandalous. "Mr. Callahan has been providing technical expertise for water management systems," Etta replied with dignity, refusing to be intimidated by Eleanor's obvious disapproval. "His assistance has been purely professional and absolutely essential for the success of my homestead operations. Of course, Eleanor agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How fortunate that Wesley's travels brought him to precisely the location where such expertise was needed. What remarkable timing. The conversation continued with a superficial politeness that barely concealed the underlying tensions between the three participants. Eleanor made it clear that she considered Wes's activities to be misguided charity work that had delayed more important business obligations. Etta maintained her dignity despite the obvious condescension of Eleanor's attitude. Wes struggled to balance his loyalty to both women while managing the social complications that Eleanor's presence had introduced. As the day progressed, Eleanor's true purpose became apparent. She had not come merely to escort Wes home, but to ensure that his frontier adventure ended definitively, and that he returned to the responsibilities and relationships that his family considered appropriate. "Wesley, dear," she said during their final evening together, "surely you can see that this situation is not sustainable. You have responsibilities to your family and to our future together that cannot be indefinitely postponed for charitable impulses." The casual dismissal of his work as mere charity stung more than Wes had expected. What Eleanor failed to understand was that his week with Etta had provided him with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that his previous business activities had never offered. That night, as Wes prepared for his departure the following morning, he found himself torn between duty and desire in ways that challenged everything he had previously believed about his obligations and priorities. The life Eleanor represented offered security, social approval, and continuation of family traditions. The life he had glimpsed with Etta offered authenticity, partnership, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful from honest effort. As he lay in his makeshift quarters in the barn, listening to the sounds of the frontier night and thinking about the woman in the cabin who had taught him so much about courage and determination, Wes faced the most difficult decision of his life. In the morning, he would have to choose between the expectations that had shaped his entire existence and the possibilities that a week of shared labor had revealed. The choice would determine not only his own future, but also the fate of the remarkable woman who had shown him what true partnership could mean. The morning of departure arrived gray and windless, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath, in anticipation of the difficult choices that lay ahead. Etta had risen before dawn to prepare a farewell breakfast. Though the simple meal felt more like a funeral gathering than a celebration of their successful partnership, Eleanor descended from her room at the town hotel with the punctuality of someone accustomed to having her schedule accommodated by others. She had spent the previous evening making pointed observations about the primitive conditions of frontier life and the obvious inappropriateness of Wes's extended involvement in Etta's personal affairs. "Wesley, the carriage is ready whenever. You've completed your farewells," Eleanor announced, her tone suggesting that such formalities should be brief and businesslike. "We have a train to catch in Millbrook, and Father's condition requires our immediate return." Wes stood beside the completed well, his traveling bags packed, but his expression troubled by the weight of conflicting obligations. The physical evidence of their shared work surrounded them: the functioning water system, the completed furniture projects, the improved infrastructure that would serve Etta and her child for years to come. "Mrs. Dunne," he said formally, extending his hand in a gesture that maintained proper social distance despite the intimacy that had developed between them over the past week. "I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this project. It has been an honor to work alongside someone of your skill and determination." "Mr. Callahan," Etta replied, accepting his handshake while struggling to keep her voice steady. "Your assistance has made all the difference in my ability to maintain this homestead and provide for my child. I will never forget your kindness and expertise." The formal exchange masked emotions that ran far deeper than either felt comfortable expressing in Eleanor's presence. What had begun as practical cooperation had evolved into something approaching love, though neither had acknowledged these feelings directly, even to themselves. Eleanor observed this interaction with the sharp attention of someone who recognized emotional undercurrents despite their careful concealment. Her expression shifted from mere impatience to something approaching alarm as she realized that Wes's involvement with the frontier widow might be more significant than she had initially assumed. "Wesley," she said with forced brightness, "we really must be going. Your mother has planned a welcome reception for this evening, and it would be terribly disappointing if we arrived late due to unnecessary delays." The mention of family expectations and social obligations served as a pointed reminder of the world that Wes was expected to return to a world of formal events, business responsibilities, and predetermined relationships that left little room for individual choice or authentic feeling. As Wes loaded his bags into Eleanor's carriage, Etta retreated to her cabin to avoid the pain of watching his actual departure. She understood that his obligations to family and finance took precedence over whatever personal feelings might have developed between them, but understanding didn't diminish the sense of loss that threatened to overwhelm her. From her kitchen window, she watched the carriage disappear into the distance, carrying away the man who had transformed her desperate circumstances into genuine hope for the future. The well continued to flow steadily, providing the water that would ensure her survival, but the sense of partnership and possibility that had sustained her throughout their week together was departing with the elegant vehicle that represented a world she could never enter. Eleanor maintained cheerful conversation during their journey to town, discussing family news and social events with the assumption that such topics would reclaim Wes's attention from whatever frontier fascination had temporarily distracted him. But her observations of his distracted responses and frequent glances back toward Etta's homestead convinced her that more decisive action might be necessary. "Wesley, dear," she said as they approached Millbrook, "I feel compelled to address something that may be delicate but cannot be ignored. Your association with that woman has created certain impressions that could prove damaging to your reputation and to our family's standing in the community." Wes turned to study Eleanor with new attention, recognizing that her concern extended beyond simple social propriety to questions of personal loyalty and future commitments. "What impressions exactly, Eleanor?" "Surely you can see how it appears," she replied with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who was being deliberately obtuse. A wealthy unmarried man spending a week in intimate collaboration with a pregnant widow living on her property, sharing meals and domestic arrangements. The implications are quite clear, regardless of whatever innocent explanations might be offered. The accusation implicit in her words struck Wes like a physical blow. Eleanor was suggesting that his assistance to Etta could be interpreted as something morally questionable, that his week of honest labor and genuine partnership might be viewed as taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. "Eleanor, I want to be absolutely clear about something," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge that she had never heard before. "My assistance to Mrs. Dunne was entirely honorable and completely professional. Any suggestion to the contrary is both false and insulting to a remarkable woman who deserves only respect and admiration." The intensity of his defense surprised both of them. Eleanor realized that she had underestimated the depth of Wes's feelings, while Wes found himself articulating emotions that he had been reluctant to acknowledge, even to himself. "Of course, darling," Eleanor said quickly, recognizing that she had overplayed her hand. "I never meant to suggest anything improper about your actions. I'm simply concerned about how others might misinterpret your charitable impulses." But the damage had been done. Wes now understood that Eleanor viewed his week with Etta not as meaningful work, but as a potential scandal to be managed and contained. The realization forced him to confront fundamental questions about the woman he was expected to marry and the life he was expected to live. During their train journey back to Colorado, Eleanor made numerous attempts to restore their previous easy rapport, but Wes found himself increasingly distracted by thoughts of the woman he had left behind. Etta's courage in facing impossible circumstances, her grace under pressure, and her unwavering commitment to building a meaningful life for herself and her child contrasted sharply with Eleanor's focus on social appearances and conventional expectations. The contrast became even more apparent when they arrived at the Callahan ranch to find that his father's deteriorating condition consisted primarily of impatience with business decisions that required Wes's signature rather than any actual medical emergency. The manufactured crisis that had demanded his immediate return proved to be a manipulation designed to end his frontier adventure and return him to family control. "Son," his father said during their first private conversation, "Eleanor has explained your extended delay and the circumstances that detained you. While I appreciate your charitable impulses, such activities are not appropriate for someone in your position. We have responsibilities to the family business and to maintaining proper social standards." The lecture continued with familiar themes about duty, reputation, and the importance of making decisions based on practical considerations rather than emotional impulses. Wes listened with growing frustration as his father dismissed the most meaningful week of his adult life as a temporary aberration that should be forgotten as quickly as possible. "Father," Wes interrupted finally, "the work I accomplished in Dakota Territory was neither charity nor distraction. It was the most valuable and satisfying experience I've had in years. Mrs. Dunne is an exceptional woman who deserves respect, not dismissive characterizations of her circumstances." His father's expression shifted from paternal patience to genuine concern as he realized that his son's involvement with the frontier widow might be more serious than Eleanor had indicated. "Wesley, I hope you're not allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment about appropriate relationships and suitable marriage partners." The conversation that followed made clear the family's expectations for Wes's future. Eleanor represented not just personal companionship, but a business alliance that would strengthen the Callahan holdings and ensure continuity of family influence. Any deviation from these plans would be viewed as betrayal of generational sacrifices and accumulated achievements. Meanwhile, back on her Dakota homestead, Etta struggled to adjust to the solitude that had returned with Wes's departure. The completed projects surrounding her provided constant reminders of their shared work, while the steady flow of water from their well served as evidence that their partnership had achieved its practical objectives. But the emotional void left by his absence seemed to grow larger each day. She found herself listening for the sound of approaching horses, hoping against reason that he might return to complete some forgotten task or to share news of his family situation. The silence of the prairie, which had once provided comforting solitude, now felt oppressive and lonely. Dr. Patterson made his monthly visit and pronounced both mother and child to be thriving. But he also noticed the melancholy that had settled over Etta since Wes's departure. "Mrs. Dunne, you seem troubled by something beyond the usual concerns of expectant mothers. Is there anything specific that's causing you distress?" Etta struggled to explain her situation without revealing the depth of her feelings for a man who belonged to a different world and was promised to another woman. "I've grown accustomed to having assistance with the heavier work around the homestead. Managing everything alone requires adjustment." Dr. Patterson nodded sympathetically, understanding that frontier isolation could be particularly difficult for women approaching childbirth. But he also sensed that Etta's distress stemmed from more than simple loneliness or physical challenges. As autumn advanced and her pregnancy entered its final months, Etta forced herself to focus on practical preparations for the birth and for managing the homestead independently. The water system that she and Wes had created together would ensure her survival, but she would need to develop new strategies for handling the daily challenges of frontier life without the partnership that had made everything seem possible. In Colorado, Wes went through the motions of resuming his previous life while struggling with growing certainty that he had made a fundamental mistake in leaving Dakota Territory. Eleanor's constant presence and the family's obvious satisfaction with his return only emphasized how hollow his supposedly privileged existence felt compared to the authentic partnership he had discovered with Etta. The engagement ring that Eleanor wore prominently represented commitments that increasingly felt like shackles rather than promises. Each family dinner and social event reinforced his understanding that the life being planned for him would never provide the sense of purpose and genuine connection that a single week of honest labor had revealed. As winter approached, both Wes and Etta faced the realization that their brief partnership had fundamentally changed their understanding of what life could offer, even as circumstances seemed to make their reunion impossible. The choices ahead would determine whether love could overcome the barriers of social expectation and economic disparity, or whether duty and convention would triumph over the authentic connection they had discovered in the process of digging a well that had become so much more than a simple source of water. The confrontation Etta had been dreading arrived sooner than expected, though not in the form she had anticipated. Rather than another visit from Banker Morrison or representatives of the Callahan Consortium, the challenge came from within her. Own body as premature labor began during the first severe blizzard of winter. The pains started just after midnight, waking Etta from restless sleep with an intensity that immediately distinguished them from the false contractions that had been troubling her for weeks. The baby was coming 6 weeks early during a storm that had already deposited 2 feet of snow and showed no signs of abating before morning. Through the cabin windows, Etta could see nothing but swirling white that obliterated all familiar landmarks. The wind howled around the small structure with a ferocity that made the walls shake, while snow accumulated against the door with alarming speed. Even if Dr. Patterson had been available, which he wasn't during his monthly circuit to distant homesteads, no one could have traveled through such conditions to reach her isolated property. She was entirely alone, facing childbirth under circumstances that challenged even experienced frontier women. The baby would arrive, whether conditions were favorable or not, and Etta would need to rely entirely on her own resources and the preparations she had made based on advice from other women in the community that between contractions. She forced herself to think systematically about immediate needs. Water from the well that she and Wes had completed together, heated over the wood stove that Thomas had installed with characteristic attention to efficiency. Clean linens that she had been preparing for months, carefully stored in the cedar chest that had been her grandmother's wedding gift. Sharp scissors sterilized in boiling water, string for tying the umbilical cord, and warm blankets for the baby who would enter the world during one of the most brutal storms in recent memory. The labor progressed with frightening intensity, suggesting that the baby was indeed determined to arrive despite the adverse circumstances. Etta found herself grateful for every piece of advice that experienced mothers had shared, every story of frontier childbirth that had seemed unnecessarily dramatic when heard in the comfort of community gatherings. As dawn approached without any lessening of the storm's fury, Etta realized that her situation had become even more precarious than she had initially understood. The snow was accumulating faster than the wind could redistribute it, creating drifts that would make travel impossible for days even after the storm ended. She would need to manage not only the birth itself, but also the crucial first days of her child's life without any possibility of outside assistance. The isolation that had once provided privacy and independence now felt like a trap that could prove fatal if complications arose. Every frontier woman knew stories of births that had gone tragically wrong despite the presence of experienced midwives and medical attention. Attempting childbirth alone during a blizzard while still grieving her husband's murder and grappling with the betrayal represented by Wes's deception tested the limits of even her considerable determination. But as the contractions intensified and the moment of birth approached, Etta found herself drawing strength from unexpected sources. Thomas's memory provided comfort and encouragement, as if his spirit was somehow present to support her through the ordeal that would bring their child into the world. The cabin that they had built together offered protection from the storm, while the well that represented their shared dreams continued to provide the water essential for survival. Even more surprisingly, she found herself thinking of Wes with something approaching gratitude, despite the devastating revelations contained in Thomas's journal. Whatever his motivations might have been, his assistance had ensured that she possessed the resources necessary to survive this crisis. The completed well meant adequate water, the improved cabin provided better shelter, and the various projects they had finished together had created an environment where both she and her baby could have a chance at survival. The baby arrived just as the storm reached its peak intensity, entering the world with a strong cry that seemed to challenge the howling wind outside. A daughter, healthy and vigorous despite her premature arrival, with dark hair that reminded Etta poignantly of Thomas's, coloring and eyes that seemed to hold infinite possibilities for the future. Hope, Etta whispered, using the name she had chosen months earlier as a declaration of faith in better times ahead. Your name is Hope, and you represent everything good that your father and I dreamed of building together. The immediate post-birth period required all of Etta's attention and energy. Caring for a newborn under normal circumstances was challenging enough. Doing so alone, during a blizzard, while recovering from childbirth, pushed her capabilities to their absolute limits. But somehow she managed the essential tasks, keeping the baby warm and fed, maintaining adequate heat in the cabin, and monitoring both of their conditions for signs of complications that could prove fatal without medical intervention. The storm continued for 3 days, trapping them in complete isolation, while Etta adjusted to the realities of motherhood under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. But gradually, both mother and child established routines that provided some sense of stability and normalcy. Hope proved to be a remarkably strong baby, nursing well and sleeping soundly, despite the challenging conditions of her birth. On the 4th morning, Etta woke to silence that felt almost unnatural after days of constant wind. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow that had drifted into shapes that obscured familiar landmarks and created an entirely new geography around the homestead. It was then that she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving slowly through the deep snow. Her first emotion was relief at the prospect of human contact after her ordeal, but wariness quickly replaced welcome as she realized that few people would be traveling so soon after such a severe storm unless they had compelling reasons for making the dangerous journey. Through her window, she could see 5 men on horseback, their faces obscured by heavy winter clothing, but their purposeful approach suggesting that this was not a casual visit to check on her welfare. One of the riders was clearly Morrison, recognizable despite his winter gear by his characteristic nervous posture and the particular way he sat his horse. The other men were strangers, but their expensive equipment and confident bearing marked them as individuals accustomed to having their orders followed without question. These were not local farmers or concerned neighbors. They were representatives of interests that possessed both the resources and the motivation to travel through dangerous conditions when business objectives required their presence. Etta's mind raced as she considered her limited options. The baby was only 4 days old, too young to be exposed to harsh weather conditions. Yet remaining in the cabin might mean facing confrontation that could prove equally dangerous. Thomas's journal, with its devastating evidence of the Callahan Consortium's criminal activities, was hidden but not destroyed, representing both potential protection and mortal threat depending on how she chose to use it. The riders reached her cabin and dismounted with the deliberate movements of men who had planned their approach carefully. Morrison knocked on her door with unusual confidence, clearly expecting his visit to achieve results that his previous efforts had failed to accomplish. "Mrs. Dunne," he called out, his voice carrying through the wooden door with artificial joviality. That failed to mask underlying threat. "I've brought some gentlemen who are very interested in discussing purchase options for your property. Given your recent circumstances, I'm sure you'll find their offer quite generous." The timing was obviously deliberate. Morrison and his associates had waited until the storm trapped her in isolation, when she was most vulnerable due to childbirth, and least able to seek assistance from neighbors or law enforcement. They expected to find her desperate, exhausted, and ready to accept whatever terms they chose to offer. Instead, they would discover a woman who possessed information that could destroy their entire operation, who had spent 4 days of forced solitude planning for exactly this confrontation, and who was fighting not just for her own survival, but for the future of the daughter who represented her. And Thomas's dreams made manifest. Etta wrapped Hope carefully in warm blankets and placed her in the sturdy crib that Wes had helped complete during their week together. Then she retrieved Thomas's journal from its hiding place and positioned herself where she could see the approaching men while maintaining access to the rifle that Thomas had taught her to use for protection against wild animals. The real test of her courage and determination was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether truth could overcome deception, and whether a frontier woman armed with evidence and righteous anger could stand successfully against the powerful interests that had already destroyed her family once. Outside, the men were conferring in low voices, planning their approach for what they clearly expected to be a routine intimidation of a helpless widow. They had no idea that their intended victim possessed documentation of their crimes, or that she had spent the past month preparing for this moment with the methodical determination that had already enabled her to survive challenges that would have defeated less resolute individuals. As Morrison approached her door for the second time, Etta took a deep breath and prepared to face the representatives of the conspiracy that had murdered her husband, threatened her independence, and underestimated her willingness to fight for the future she was determined to build for herself and her daughter. The final confrontation was about to begin. And everything that Thomas had died for, everything that she and Wes had built together despite his deception, and everything that her daughter's future depended upon, would be decided in the next few minutes of carefully chosen words and strategically revealed truths. "Mrs. Dunne, we know you're in there," Morrison called through the door with growing impatience. "These gentlemen have traveled a considerable distance to make you a very generous offer. It would be in your best interests to hear what they have to say." Etta opened the door slowly, revealing herself with hope cradled in her arms, a deliberate choice to remind her visitors that they were threatening not just a woman, but also an innocent child. The sight of the newborn seemed to give some of the men momentary pause, though Morrison himself appeared unmoved by the evidence of recent childbirth. "Gentlemen," Etta said with calm dignity, "I assume you've come to discuss the purchase of my property. Before we begin such negotiations, however, I think you should understand exactly what you're attempting to acquire." She gestured for them to enter the cabin, noting how they arranged themselves to block any possible escape routes. These were men accustomed to intimidating vulnerable people, and they had clearly planned this confrontation to leave her with no alternatives except submission to their demands. "Mrs. Dunne," Morrison began with oily solicitude, "I want to introduce you to Mr. James Crawford, who represents certain business interests that have been monitoring development opportunities in this region. Given your recent personal losses and your obvious need for financial security, Mr. Crawford is prepared to make an offer that should resolve all your concerns." Crawford was a thin man with predatory eyes who studied Etta and her surroundings with the calculating attention of someone evaluating assets rather than considering human circumstances. His expensive clothing and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to having his wishes accommodated without question. "Mrs. Dunne," Crawford said in a voice that attempted warmth but achieved only false sincerity, "I understand you've experienced tragic losses recently. My associates and I are prepared to offer you $1,200 for your property, considerably more than fair market value, which would provide you and your child with sufficient resources to relocate somewhere more appropriate for your circumstances." The offer was indeed generous by local standards, representing perhaps twice what most homesteads in the region might command in normal sales. But Etta understood that the premium price reflected the property's strategic value rather than charitable impulses toward a struggling widow. "Mr. Crawford," she replied evenly, "before I consider your offer, I think you should understand that I possess certain information about your business operations that might affect the terms of our negotiation." She moved to her kitchen table and retrieved Thomas's journal, noting how the men's attention immediately focused on the leather-bound volume with an intensity that confirmed her suspicions about its significance. "My late husband was a careful man who documented his observations about local business activities," Etta continued, opening the journal to one of its most damaging passages. "For instance, he noted the connection between the Callahan Consortium, local mining operations, and systematic efforts to acquire property throughout this region through methods that might not withstand legal scrutiny." The change in the men's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Morrison's nervous fidgeting intensified, while Crawford's false friendliness was replaced by something approaching alarm. The other men shifted positions slightly, their hands moving closer to weapons that Etta now realized they had carried into her home. "Mrs. Dunne," Crawford said carefully, "I'm not sure what you think you've discovered, but I can assure you that all our business activities are entirely legal and properly documented." "I'm sure they are," Etta agreed with deceptive mildness. "For instance, I'm certain that the mine collapse that killed my husband was investigated thoroughly and found to be an unavoidable accident. I'm equally certain that the safety violations Thomas documented were addressed promptly by the appropriate authorities." She turned several pages in the journal, revealing detailed drawings and technical descriptions that Thomas had compiled during his final weeks Of course, Thomas's engineering background allowed him to document these safety concerns with considerable precision. His analysis of structural inadequacies, equipment failures, and deliberate cost-cutting measures creates a rather comprehensive picture of corporate negligence. Crawford exchanged glances with his associates, clearly recognizing that their intended victim possessed information that could prove extremely damaging if it reached the wrong authorities. Mrs. Dunne, I think you may be misunderstanding certain aspects of these complex business relationships. Perhaps, Etta conceded, but I think the territorial authorities might find Thomas's documentation quite illuminating, particularly his correspondence with safety inspectors, who were pressured to overlook violations that directly contributed to the mine collapse. Attention in the room increased perceptibly as the men realized that their carefully planned intimidation was encountering unexpected resistance. Morrison attempted to reassert control of the situation through familiar appeals to feminine helplessness and practical necessity. Mrs. Dunne, you must understand that raising these unfounded accusations could prove very dangerous for someone in your vulnerable position, he said with transparent threat. A woman alone with a newborn child cannot afford to make enemies of people who have the resources to protect their legitimate business interests. Is that a threat, Mr. Morrison? Etta asked with dangerous quiet, shifting Hope to a more secure position while maintaining easy access to the rifle that leaned against the wall behind her. It's practical advice, Crawford interjected smoothly. Mrs. Dunne, we're prepared to increase our offer to $1,500 in recognition of the emotional attachments you might have to this property. Such generosity should demonstrate our desire to resolve this matter amicably. The increased offer confirmed what Etta already understood. These men were desperate to acquire her property and eliminate any evidence of their criminal activities. But their desperation also represented opportunity if she could manage the situation carefully enough to protect herself and her daughter while ensuring that justice was served. Gentlemen, she said with calm determination, I think we need to discuss this matter more frankly. You want my property because it occupies a strategic position for your railroad development plans. I want justice for my husband's murder and protection for my daughter's future. Perhaps we can find a mutually acceptable arrangement. The word murder hung in the air like an accusation that none of the men seemed prepared to address directly. Crawford's mask of civilized negotiation slipped slightly, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath the surface politeness. Mrs. Dunne, you're making very serious allegations that could have unfortunate consequences for everyone involved, he said with quiet menace. I strongly advise you to reconsider both your accusations and your negotiating position. But Etta was no longer the desperate widow they had expected to intimidate into submission. 4 days of solitude with Thomas's journal had transformed her understanding of her situation and her own capabilities. She was fighting not just for survival, but for vindication of her husband's death and protection of her daughter's inheritance. Mr. Crawford, she replied with steel in her voice, I think you should understand that copies of Thomas's documentation have already been placed in secure locations where they will be discovered if anything unfortunate happens to me or my child. Your choices are quite simple. Negotiate honestly or face legal consequences that will destroy everything you've worked to build. The claim about copies was a bluff, but a convincing one given Thomas's obvious attention to detail and systematic approach to documentation. Crawford studied her face carefully, trying to determine whether she possessed the resources and planning capability to have actually implemented such protection. Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced additional complications to an already tense situation. Through her window, Etta could see another rider approaching through the snow, moving with the urgency of someone who had important business that couldn't wait for better traveling conditions. As the newcomer drew closer, Etta's heart stopped beating for a moment before resuming with painful intensity. Despite the heavy winter clothing and the changes that weeks of separation had wrought, she recognized Wes Callahan riding toward her cabin with the determined pace of a man who had urgent matters to resolve. The final confrontation was about to become even more complicated, and Etta would soon discover whether the man she had loved and trusted, then learned to hate and fear, had come to complete his family's business or to somehow Make amends for betrayals that had cost her everything she held dear. Wes dismounted from his horse with movements that betrayed both exhaustion from hard travel and urgency that had driven him through dangerous winter conditions. Snow clung to his coat and hat, evidence of the difficult journey he had undertaken to reach Etta's homestead during some of the worst weather of the season. Crawford and his associates turned toward the newcomer with the wariness of men who recognized potential complications to their carefully planned intimidation. Morrison's face went pale as he realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, introducing variables that his simple extortion scheme had not anticipated. Wesley Callahan, Crawford said with forced calm, clearly recognizing the heir to the consortium that employed him. This is an unexpected development. I trust your presence here doesn't indicate any complications with our current negotiations. Wes stepped through the cabin doorway, taking in the scene with a rapid assessment of someone who understood that he had arrived at a critical moment. His gaze moved from the armed men positioning themselves around Etta to the newborn baby. In her arms, to the journal lying open on the table with its damning evidence of corporate criminality. Mr. Crawford, Wes replied with ice in his voice, I think you'll find that my presence indicates very significant complications with whatever negotiations you imagined you were conducting. Etta studied Wes's face, searching for clues about his intentions and his loyalties. Had he come to complete his family's business acquisition, or was his arrival somehow connected to the revelations contained in Thomas's journal? The man standing before her bore little resemblance to the helpful partner who had worked beside her to complete the well. Yet neither did he seem like the calculating deceiver that recent discoveries had suggested. Mrs. Dunne, Wes said formally, though his eyes lingered on the baby with unmistakable emotion. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have urgent matters to discuss with you regarding these gentlemen's business proposals. Mr. Callahan, Etta replied with careful neutrality, I assume your urgent matters are related to your family's interest in acquiring my property. Perhaps you can clarify whether your previous assistance was genuine partnership or merely reconnaissance for today's negotiations. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Wes's expression reflected his understanding of how devastating the recent revelations must have been for her. Mrs. Dunne, my assistance was genuine, and my presence here today is intended to prevent, rather than advance, any coercive acquisition of your property. Crawford stepped forward with obvious alarm. Wesley, I think you may be misunderstanding the situation here. Mrs. Dunne has been making certain unfounded accusations about legitimate business activities, and we're simply trying to resolve these misunderstandings through generous compensation. The only misunderstanding, Crawford, is your assumption that I remain ignorant of my family's criminal activities. Wes replied with quiet fury. I've spent the past month investigating the documentation that Mrs. Dunne's husband compiled before his murder, and I've discovered enough evidence to ensure that you and your associates will be facing territorial authorities very soon. The word murder, spoken by a member of the Callahan family, transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Crawford and his men realized that their employer's son had somehow become an enemy rather than an ally, while Etta struggled to understand how Wes had gained access to information that she had discovered only recently. Wesley, Morrison said, with nervous desperation, surely you understand that your family's business interests require certain decisive actions when competitors or troublemakers threaten profitable operations. Your father has always expected you to support family decisions, even when they involve unpleasant necessities. My father's expectations, Wes said with dangerous calm, do not include tolerance for murder, extortion, or any of the other criminal activities you've been conducting in the Callahan name. As of this morning, I have assumed control of all family business operations, and my first decision is to terminate your employment and cooperation with territorial law enforcement in prosecuting your crimes. The revelation that Wes had somehow displaced his father's authority added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Crawford's men began shifting positions in ways that suggested they were preparing for violence rather than continued negotiation. Mr. Callahan, Crawford said with barely controlled rage, I think you may be overestimating your authority and underestimating the consequences of interfering with established business relationships. Some decisions cannot be reversed without significant costs to everyone involved. Etta watched this exchange with growing understanding of the forces that had shaped recent events. Wes had apparently discovered his family's criminal activities independently and had taken dramatic action to challenge their authority. His arrival represented either salvation or additional threat, depending on whether his reformation was genuine or merely another layer of deception. "Gentlemen," she interjected with calm authority, "I think this conversation has revealed enough about everyone's motivations and loyalties. Mr. Crawford, your generous offers are declined. Mr. Morrison, your services as my banker are no longer required. I suggest you leave my property immediately." Crawford's response was swift and unambiguous. "Mrs. Dunne, I'm afraid leaving is no longer an option for any of us. You and Mr. Callahan possess information that threatens too many important people for us to simply walk away from this situation." The men reached for their weapons with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had clearly planned for this contingency. But their assumption that they faced only a woman with a newborn and an unarmed businessman proved to be a significant miscalculation. Wes moved with surprising speed and competence, producing a revolver that he wielded with the confidence of someone trained in its use. "Crawford, I suggest you reconsider your options very carefully. Threatening a woman and child adds kidnapping and attempted murder to charges that already include conspiracy, fraud, and negligent homicide." Etta shifted hope to her left arm while reaching for Thomas's rifle with her right, demonstrating that frontier women were rarely as helpless as their attackers assumed. "Gentlemen, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Your best option is to mount your horses and ride away while you still have that opportunity." The standoff lasted for several tense seconds as Crawford's men evaluated their chances against two armed defenders who clearly possessed both the skill and determination to use their weapons effectively. The presence of the baby complicated any assault, while the confined space of the cabin limited their tactical options. "This isn't over," Crawford said finally, recognizing that his carefully planned intimidation had deteriorated into a situation that offered little chance of success and significant risk of catastrophic failure. "Mrs. Dunne, you've made enemies today who have very long memories and considerable resources." "Mr. Crawford," Wes replied with cold finality, "the territorial marshal will be very interested in your threats against a frontier woman and her child. I suggest you use whatever time remains before your arrest to arrange your affairs and consider your legal defense options." The men retreated with reluctant recognition that their mission had failed completely. Not only had they failed to acquire Etta's property, but they had also revealed their criminal intentions to witnesses who possessed both the evidence and the resources necessary to ensure their prosecution died as the sound of departing horses faded into the winter silence. Etta and Wes found themselves alone together for the first time since the devastating revelations that had transformed her understanding of their relationship. The baby in her arms represented new life and future possibilities, while the weapons they still held reminded them both of the dangers they had just survived together. "Mrs. Dunne," Wes said quietly, holstering his revolver with careful deliberation, "I owe you explanations that I'm not sure you'll be willing to hear. But I want you to know that everything I told you about my feelings was genuine, despite the deceptions I was unaware of at the time." Etta studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to question everything she had previously believed. "Mr. Callahan, I think we need to have a very long conversation about truth, trust, and what kind of future might be possible for people who have been through what we've experienced together." Outside, the winter wind continued to blow across the prairie. But inside the cabin that had become a fortress against corruption and violence, two people who had been torn apart by betrayal began the difficult process of determining whether love could survive the challenges that had tested every aspect of their character and commitment. 1 year later, the Dakota Territory courthouse in Millbrook witnessed the conclusion of legal proceedings that had attracted attention from as far away as Washington. The territorial government's successful prosecution of the Callahan Consortium's criminal activities had established important precedents for corporate accountability and workers' rights that would influence frontier law for decades to come. Etta sat in the gallery holding hope, now a vibrant 1-year-old with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit. The child had taken her first steps just weeks earlier, toddling confidently around the homestead that had become both sanctuary and symbol of everything her parents had fought to build together. Judge Harrison's verdict was comprehensive and uncompromising. Morrison received 5 years in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy, while Crawford and his associates faced longer sentences for their roles in the mining operation that had caused Thomas's death. The Callahan Consortium's assets were frozen pending civil litigation that would compensate the families of miners who had died due to negligent safety practices. Asterisk. This court finds, Judge Harrison declared with grave authority, that the evidence presented demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior that threatened the safety and welfare of honest citizens seeking to build productive lives on the American frontier. Such conduct cannot be tolerated in any civilized society, regardless of the wealth or influence of those who perpetrate it. Wes sat beside Etta, his presence representing the most complex aspect of the year's transformations. His decision to testify against his own family's business interests had provided crucial evidence for the prosecution, though it had also cost him his inheritance and his relationship with his father. The elder Callahan had disowned his son publicly, declaring that family loyalty should supersede all other considerations. Asterisk. The personal cost of Wes's choice had been enormous, but it had also demonstrated the authenticity of his reformation and his commitment to the principles that Etta valued above all others. During the months of legal proceedings, he had worked alongside her to expand their homestead operations, proving that his technical skills and business knowledge could serve honest purposes rather than criminal ones. Their relationship had evolved slowly and carefully, built on foundations of shared work and mutual respect, rather than the romantic intensity that had characterized their initial attraction. Etta had insisted on complete honesty about the past, and absolute transparency about future intentions before allowing their partnership to develop beyond professional cooperation. Trust, she had told him during one of their long evening conversations, is not something that can be rebuilt quickly after it's been shattered. If we're going to have a future together, it must be based on truth rather than convenience or emotion. Wes had accepted her conditions without reservation, understanding that his actions would need to speak louder than his words if he hoped to earn her forgiveness and her love. He had sold his remaining personal assets to compensate families affected by his father's criminal enterprise, had worked without pay to improve infrastructure throughout the region, and had demonstrated through daily choices that his commitment to justice was genuine rather than strategic. The homestead itself had prospered beyond their most optimistic projections. The well that had brought them together continued to provide abundant water, supporting not only their own needs, but also serving neighboring properties during particularly dry seasons. Their cattle operation had grown from modest beginnings to impressive productivity. While their vegetable gardens supplied food for several families in the surrounding area, Thomas's memory was honored throughout their expanded operations. Rocking chair he had begun carving now sat in Hope's nursery, completed with loving attention to his original design. His engineering expertise guided their irrigation systems and structural improvements, while his documentation of criminal activities had ensured that justice was served for his murder and the deaths of his fellow miners. Mrs. Callahan, Dr. Patterson said, as he concluded his monthly examination of Hope, "Your daughter is thriving remarkably well. Frontier life clearly agrees with both of you." The name still felt strange to Etta, even 6 months after her wedding. To Wes, in a simple ceremony that had been witnessed by the entire community. Their marriage had been celebrated not just as a romantic union, but as a symbol of the frontier's capacity for redemption and new beginnings. Eleanor Whitmore had married a railroad executive from Chicago, a union that satisfied her social ambitions, while providing her with a husband who shared her values and expectations. She had sent a brief but gracious note congratulating Wes on his marriage, acknowledging that their engagement had been based more on family expectations than personal compatibility. The community of Millbrook had embraced Etta and Wes as examples of the resilience and moral courage that defined the best aspects of frontier life. Their successful stand against corporate corruption had inspired other homesteaders to organize for mutual protection and political representation. leading to territorial legislation that strengthened workers' rights and environmental protections. Elena Martinez had become Hope's unofficial grandmother, sharing childcare responsibilities and cultural traditions that enriched the young family's understanding of the diverse heritage that was shaping the American West. Her own sons had grown into capable young men who helped manage the expanding cattle operations while pursuing their own educational and career goals. As autumn approached, and Hope celebrated her first birthday, Etta and Wes stood together beside the well that had changed both their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. The water continued to flow steadily, providing life and prosperity, while serving as a constant reminder of what could be accomplished when people worked together with honesty and determination. Do you ever regret the choices you made? Etta asked as they watched Hope playing contentedly in the grass beside Thomas's completed rocking chair. Never, Wes replied without hesitation. Losing my family's wealth was painful, but gaining your trust and love was worth any sacrifice. This life we've built together means more to me than all the inherited privileges I gave up to earn it. Their conversation was interrupted by Hope's delighted laughter as she discovered a butterfly that had landed on her toy horse. The sound carried across the prairie like a promise of continued joy and future possibilities, reminding them both that their struggles had been worthwhile because they had created something beautiful and lasting from the challenges that had tested their character and commitment. The homestead stretched around them in all directions, productive and peaceful under the vast Dakota sky. Cattle grazed contentedly on grass that benefited from the irrigation systems they had designed together, while gardens provided abundant food that reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic beauty. As evening approached and the three of them gathered around the dinner table that Wes had crafted to replace the simple furniture Thomas had originally installed, Etta reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet contentment. The path had been marked by tragedy, betrayal, and challenges that had seemed insurmountable, yet somehow they had emerged stronger and more complete than they had been individually. Hope babbled happily in her high chair, reaching for the wooden blocks that Wes had carved for her entertainment. The child represented hope fulfilled, dreams realized, and the continuation of love that had transcended death and overcome every obstacle that greed and corruption had placed in its path. Outside their cabin windows, the well continued to provide water that sustained all life on their property, while Thomas's memory lived on in every improvement they made and every choice they faced with a moral courage he had demonstrated through his own sacrifice. Frontier that had tested them so severely had also provided them with opportunities for growth, redemption, and the creation of something genuinely valuable from the raw materials of determination and authentic love. Their story would become part of the region's history, inspiring future generations who face their own challenges in building meaningful lives from honest effort and unwavering principle. As darkness settled over the prairie and the family prepared for sleep, Etta knew with absolute certainty that every struggle had been worthwhile because it had led to this moment of perfect peace and infinite possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that love, justice, and determination had triumphed over every force that had threatened to destroy their dreams. The well flowed on through the darkness, providing life and hope for whatever the future might bring to the family that had been forged through adversity and strengthened by their willingness to fight for what they believed was right and true and lasting.